I'm starting off here with my reference image imported into my front viewport. And again, I went to Options, Configure in my front view, and I've imported my image. I have offset it so that this first one, which I'm using as my model that I'm going to trace, is centered at the 0, 0, 0 axis. And I also have my transparency here. It's a little low, but I'm going to make this much higher so that I can see what I'm doing. So to create an object like this, a lathe is a really good choice because it takes the spline that you give it, and by default it takes it and it spins it 360 around the location of the lathe, which when it comes out it's located at 0, 0, 0. So it gives you a symmetrical object. So if you have a symmetrical object like this wine glass, like a vase, like a bottle, whatever it might be, even if it's like a machine part or something like that, if it's symmetrical, a quick way to create that shape is to just give a slice of it as a spline, and then the lathe will be able to create the rest of the shape. So I'm going to use the spline pen to draw the edge of the wine glass, and the lathe will then be able to create the geometry for me. So because the lathe is really reliant on having just a sliver of the symmetrical object, that's why none of these other primitives really work, because they are full form. Like you have a full circle, you have a full star. So if you put those inside a lathe, it just ends up overlapping because it's got more than it needs. Okay, but for the wine glass here, what I'm basically going to draw is going to be just the edge here, and you'll see it once I draw it, and hopefully that will make sense. You don't want to draw the whole wine glass. You would do that if you were trying to make an icon and extrude it or something like that. But if you want the full shape in the round, then a lathe is a great option for that because it's going to be able to make this shape in the full 360, but you only need to provide a small portion of that object. Because it's symmetrical, you shouldn't have to worry about it being different on either side. That's sort of the point here. Okay. The other thing I want to note is that this reference is really good. It's straight on. It's got a very clear background, so you can see where the object begins and ends. There's not too much perspective. You can tell by the top of the lip of the glass here that there's not too much of the back that we're seeing. But there is a little bit perspective down here, so I don't want to draw this curve in. I want it to be flat, and then we'll see the curve ourselves depending on the angle of our perspective view, but we don't actually want to trace this curvature here because that's what we're getting from the angle of the photograph itself. Okay, so I'm going to lower the transparency here because it will be a little bit hard for me to see where my spline line is going when it's this sort of full quality here. So I'm going to bring my transparency down pretty low to like 80 here, so I can just see the details of it, but it's not going to take too much away from what I'm working with. So I really want to be able to see my spline. So I'm going to go up here and get my spline pen. Okay, and I'm going to again, I'm not going to follow this curve because I don't want to build in a curve and create an oval base. I want to make sure that I model this flat. So I'm going to go, since this is where the tip of the edge of the glass is, I'm going to go across from there. So I'm going to go here, click, and then I'm going to go straight across. And you can always adjust this later. Okay, and so I'm using the spline pen and I'm clicking to create my hard tangent. I'm clicking and dragging like right here if I want to make a soft tangent and have a curve. So I'm just going to go along. Okay, and the goal with when you're creating a spline path is to try and use as few points as possible. Okay, and the reason for that is so that you will not have to edit too much. If the more splines there is, or not the more splines, but the more points there are, the more chances there are for the line to have angular spots. Um, the larger areas that you have that are covered by the curved soft tangents, they will be smoother, obviously. So if you add too many points, you'll have a hard time smoothing the spline out. Okay, so I'm just going up here, following the edge, not worrying about anything in the interior right now. I'm just going along and making sure that um, I get an accurate line. Okay, and you could always get a rough shape here, and then you could always go back if you're somebody who would rather go back and tweak it afterwards. That's totally fine as well. But I'm trying to get this pretty close, so I don't have to do too much when I come back to it. Okay, and I'm going to come up to the top here, and I'm going to stop and show you what it looks like. Okay, so now I'm going to hit escape. All right, and zoom out. And there is my spline. Okay, now if you want to adjust it, you can use the move tool, and you can click, and you can move your points around if you want to. Okay, if you want to adjust the curve, then if you already have a curve there, you can just click and pull on it. Okay, if you want to add a curve to a point that doesn't have handles, you can right click and you could say you want soft tangents, and that will allow you to have handles to adjust the curvature there. Okay, if you don't want it, then you could go hard tangents, and that will revert it back to a regular your default point. Okay, so it looks like this. So I'll show you what it looks like when I stick this into a lathe now. Okay, this is what it looks like in my perspective window. Okay, I'm going to go back to model mode so that I don't have that point selected. Okay, so there's my spline, and as you can see, it's literally just like as if we cut just a teeny tiny little bit out of the object. Okay, and that's the goal here, is that we just need a sliver. Okay, because when I put it into a lathe now, the lathe is going to make the rest of it based on this shape. So I drop this into, so I take the spline, move it up, look for the down arrow when it hovers over it, and let go. Okay, and now I have my wine glass. Okay, now a couple of things to note, okay, is that we have a hole here in the middle. Okay, and this hole is indeed a hole. It is going to be, if you were to pour liquid into this, you would see the liquid actually go into the stem, and that's because we didn't close the spline off there. So there is, the only place that's actually connected is the base, because when it spins around, you would have the other side match up exactly here, but we do have a gap here where the stem is, so that does actually create a hole. So that's one thing we can address, is to close that hole there. And then two, you'll see at the top here, it is paper thin. Okay, and again, the reason that it's paper thin is because we only traced basically the outside of the shape, and that does matter. We only traced the outside of the wine glass. We didn't actually go down on the inside, so there is no inside. There's no illusion of an inside, because we literally only have the surface for the outside. So we can adjust that. We can go in there and we can add to it. But this is what it looks right now. At least we have a successful lathe. Okay, and it looks like our reference, which is good. So if there's anything about it right now that you don't like, that you think it's a little bit clunky in places, or it's got some bad edges, that would be going back to your spline to adjust the shape, because you'll see that the spline that you gave it is exactly what you're going to get in the lathe. It's just going to make it a 360 from that starting point. So if the spline, if you imagine the spline being 0 degrees, it's spinning the geometry from there 360 degrees to get you this shape, which indeed would be symmetrical, and that's why it only works with symmetrical objects. Okay, so I'm going to go back in to address the hollow stem and the paper thin thickness that I've got up here. And this is easy to do, to go back and to keep working with your spline. You go back to your front viewport. Okay, I'm going to turn off the lathe. There's my spline. Okay, I want to keep working with it, so I'm going to go back. I went to model mode, so now I'm going to go back to point mode, because that's how you adjust a spline's points. Okay, and the great thing about this is if you just want to keep working on it, you just have to go and click on the last point that you had been working with. Now make sure you have the spline pen on. Okay, go find the last point that you were working with in your spline path, click on it, and you'll see that it will indeed pick it up and you can start drawing. Okay, you want to make sure that you do that, because if you don't do that, you will create a second spline. And if you create a second spline and you have spline 1 and spline 2, they will not work with the lathe. Okay, a lathe will only take one spline. You'll have to either find a way to combine it into one spline, or you'll have to redo it. So in this case, make sure that you just pick up where you left off, and you do that by selecting your spline pen. Okay, click the last point you made, all right, and then you can keep going. Okay, so I'm going to make myself a little bit of a curve here. I'm not going to worry too much about where it's placed, because I'm going to go back later and adjust it, but I do want to give myself a little bit of a curve there for the lip that I can work with. And I'm going to go down here, and I'm going to keep this pretty thin. You can see that there's like a little bit of a black edge here where the glass is thicker. You can use that as your reference for this. Okay, so I'm just going to follow that down. And you can see here there is the where the liquid ends. That's what I'm going to use as my reference as well for what the inside of this shape should be. I'm just going to follow that, okay? And doing this and bringing it all the way over to the 0, 0, 0 mark is going to fix that problem I had before with the hollow stem. Okay, I'm going to be able to fill that in if I make sure to have this connect. Okay, so I'm going to put this point here, and I'm going to make sure that this goes to 0, 0 there. Okay, I think that looks good. So I'm just going to adjust it a little bit, and what I would do is I'm going to adjust it as much as I think it needs, and then I would go back and I would check the lathe and see what the lathe looks like, and then adjust when I know what the geometry looks like. Okay, so that way I can make sure that I'm not doing something twice for no reason. Okay, so I'll go up here, and the last thing I want to do is fix this lip that I have here. It's a little bit too high and coming out too far, so I'm going to pull that in. Okay, this is too close. There we go. All right, so now you can see, hopefully you can see the difference here in the addition that I added. I've got now my spline goes inside the shape. I will now hopefully have solved both problems. I will have addressed that it is paper thin by having this little bit of extra thickness now. And I will also have taken care of the hollow stem that I had previously. Okay, so go back to my perspective window. Okay, and this is what the spline looks like now. You see a little bit of adjustment, the same outside, but now I've got that extra interior piece for the inside bowl of the wine glass. I turn my lathe back on. Okay, and so now you can see when I go over here. Okay, I got a nice lip on it. We got a nice little beveled edge there. And then inside, you can see I have filled the hole. Now, I do want to note though that there is a little weird distortion happening down here, and this is overlapping geometry. So you likely might have one or the other problem here. You either might have the point went too far, and now you've got multiple extra polygons that are twisting and overlapping on top of each other. So I went too far. I probably went a couple of pixels over 0. Or the other problem you might have is that there's a hole still there. And if there's a hole still there, then you just have to go and bring it closer to 0, 0, 0 so that way you fill the hole, okay? Because if there's a hole, the lathe is located, unless you move it, the lathe is located at 0, 0, 0 for the XYZ. So the closer you are to that, or if you're precise and you're right on top of that, you will not have a gap. But if there is a gap, then the lathe will actually build a hole there, thinking that's what you want. So to correct this, I'm just going to go to one of my views. Doesn't really matter which one, but I do need to edit the spline. So I'm going to find that middle point there for the base of the inside of the wine glass, and I'm just going to pull it. And you see here, if I pull it too far, I'm going to make a big hole, and then you can see we're right back to where we started with the gap there. If I go too far, I get all of this weird jittering, moving polygons, and that's not good. That's overlapping geometry. So my goal is to get it to where I don't see it at all. I don't see a hole, and I don't see those weird triangles. So I'm going to go, and I think it looks like right there. So I'm deselect, okay, and see what it looks like. Oh, I've got a little bit, so I'm just going to go right back and pull it back one more. Okay, and looks like this is as close as I'm going to get. There we go. Got it. Okay, perfect. So it will take a little bit of, it might take a little bit of adjustment there to fix that. Okay, and then I'm going to check the bottom as well and make sure I don't have the same problem down here. Okay, now so let me check my spline and see why this is, something might be off considering that it is showing up as black. There we go. Again, so that's something that was wrong there. Went too far. That's overlapping geometry. It certainly shouldn't show up as black. So I'm going to pull that point back until it turns off. Okay, and we're going to double check to make sure that that is no hole there. Perfect. Okay, so that's what you want. You want to make sure that you just adjust those points just enough so that you don't have any you have no overlapping geometry, and you also do not have a gap. Okay, and that will make it look like you've got a solid shape there. Okay, so everything looks good. I'm happy with it. If at this point you need to adjust anything, it's probably one of two places. It could be the spline itself, so you might have to come to the spline and adjust the points if the shape looks weird. And again, if you need help, you could try and use the spline smooth if you're having trouble drawing. Also, if you don't think it looks smooth enough, like if you're looking up here and you think the general shape of the wine glass, like the edge, the profile looks good, but then when you look at the top here, like mine, you can see that it's got some angular lines. Okay, it's not fooling anyone into thinking that's a smooth circle. So you can come to the lathe and you can go to subdivisions, and the subdivisions are set to 32. Okay, and I can make that higher. So I'm going to my display and put line mode on, and you can see what would happen if I, like, say, doubled that. Okay, but I'm going to turn the line mode off so that you can see as it happens what it looks like. All right, so that's 32, and this is 64. Okay, and now it's nice and smooth, but if you look at it with line mode on, you'll see that that's got a lot more polygons up there. Okay, so that's one way you could do it. Another way you could do it is you could use that subdivision surface that I mentioned before that we use to try and smooth out objects. So you could see if that works here. I can take that, I can drop the lathe into it, okay, and that is a good option to do because then you could sort of turn it on and off. So I left my subdivisions at 32, and I'm using a subdivision surface, which again, its job is to try and smooth out the geometry by dividing the polygons you have further. So that does the job of not only making that top circle smooth, but it also does a little bit of smoothing on the object itself. So my spline I was pretty happy with my spline, but you can see here that there's a little bit of a bumpiness maybe right there that is very subtle, but the subdivision surface gets rid of that. Okay, and then I can render that, and or I can preview it. I'm not actually rendering it, and everything looks good. Okay, so hopefully that helps, but definitely what you want to make sure is bring in your reference, put it into your front view, tweak it so that it's easy to work with and it doesn't fight against the tools that you're working with so that you can see what you're doing. And just be careful with your spline tool and follow the path. You don't need to draw the whole shape. Okay, you just need to draw the profile itself that you need. Okay, so just a sliver of it, and then put it into a lathe and see what you got, and adjust if you need to. Okay, so hopefully um, this is clear and helps everybody make their first lathe object.